Government 2305. Lesson 2. Constitutional Democracy, Promoting Liberty and Self-Government. After completing this lesson, you will be able to recall key events that led to the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, explain how the Constitution was negotiated and ratified, and identify the basic components of the Constitution. Chapter 2 describes how the principles of representative government and limited government are embodied in the Constitution and explains the tension between them. Your author also indicates how these principles have been modified in practice throughout the course of American history. Here are just a few of the main points that will be covered in this lesson. America during the colonial period developed traditions of limited government and representative government. These traditions were rooted in governing practices, political theory, and cultural values. The Constitution provides for limited government mainly by defining lawful powers and by dividing those powers among competing institutions. The Constitution in its original form provided for representative government mainly through indirect methods of electing representatives. The idea of popular government, in which the majority's desires have a more direct and immediate impact on governing officials, has gained strength since the nation's beginning. Let's start today's lesson by examining a few quotes on the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution has proved itself the most marvelously elastic compilation of rules of government ever written. Franklin D. Roosevelt. We, the people, are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution. Abraham Lincoln. The Constitution only gives people the right to pursue happiness. You have to catch it yourself. Benjamin Franklin. Alexander Hamilton, one of the key proponents for adopting the United States Constitution, once wrote, "Why has government been instituted at all? Because the passions of man will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint." In writing this, he was reiterating what political philosophers had realized since the days of Aristotle, that without a formal government and enforceable laws, people will fall short of acting in a just and reasonable manner towards each other, and society cannot peaceably and civilly exist. Alexander Hamilton, one of the key proponents for adopting the United States Constitution, once wrote, "Why has government been instituted at all? Because the passions of man will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint." In writing this, he was reiterating what political philosophers had realized since the days of Aristotle, that without a formal government and enforceable laws, people will fall short of acting in a just and reasonable manner towards each other, and society cannot peaceably and civilly exist. Enlightenment philosophers of the 17th and 18th centuries were influenced by many historical conflicts that took place during their era, and because of this, they focused their new philosophical ideas on the relationship between government and the governed. First, philosophers like John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau all believed in natural law and the state of nature. But each saw these from a very different perspective. Hobbes saw the state of nature as full of nothing but violence and conflict, and said life is nasty, brutish and short, and man must be protected against himself. Locke famously said man is born with natural rights of life, liberty, and property, and took a very practical and transactional position, seeing liberty as the right to one's property, which, especially in 18th century colonial America, was seen not only as personal property such as money and real estate, but the right to hold people as slaves or chattel. Rousseau, taking a much more liberal stance on natural law and the social contract, said man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. Governments must be responsive to the people, or it is the obligation of the people to overthrow that government. While all three of these philosophers saw government from the perspective of natural rights, natural law, and an implicit social contract, they took very different paths in interpreting those rights and the social contract that went with them. Look at the graphic on this slide. If you place the three Enlightenment philosophers on a spectrum, from extremely conservative on the right to extremely liberal on the left, we can see the ideas of Hobbes, with his belief that societies need an authoritarian or absolute ruler, with little or no say given to the people themselves, and a strong focus on security and safety. Locke is more in the middle, with his transactional and economically based philosophies that focus on republicanism, or representative government, and a focus on the protection of economic property rights. Lastly, we see Rousseau's liberal perspective of democracy, focused on direct citizen participation, and a strong emphasis on protecting individual liberties and freedoms. Let's compare the social contract theories of the three Enlightenment philosophers. Hobbes believed that people collectively agree to give up all their freedom and power to a sovereign, or absolute ruler. He said, "That a man be willing, when others are so too, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself he shall think it necessary, to lay down this right to all things, and be contented with so much liberty against other men, as he would allow other men against himself." Absolute control, which is best described as an authoritarian monarchy, where all powers and laws are by that sovereign. Government imposes law in order to prevent the state of war, and the contract is that government protects the people militarily, but the people must allow an authoritarian level of control over them. Locke said governments exist by the consent of people to protect their natural rights and promote the public good. The right of revolution is exercised when the government fails. In other words, people may rebel to redress the government. There is the principle of the rule of majority, where things are decided by the greater public, which is described as a liberal or constitutional monarchy, such as what was seen in Great Britain. Lastly, Rousseau said that a social contract is made among all people of that society to bring them in harmony. A general will is made, and agreed by the people to abide by it. He said each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will, and in a body we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. This view would be closer to direct rule by the people, as seen through the eyes of liberal republicanism or even direct democracy. But remember, he also said that whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body. So there was still room for limited government and the rule of law, even in Rousseau's more liberal interpretation of the social contract. In reflecting the ideas of Enlightenment philosophy, the writers of the Declaration of Independence, namely Thomas Jefferson, said that because of the explicit social contract between a government and the people it governs, the government is responsible for preserving rights and liberties, but mostly from the perspective of property. Locke also famously stated these as inalienable rights to live, liberty, and property, which Jefferson changed to the pursuit of happiness rather than enter the fray of debating property rights and slavery. But the ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the idea that all men are created equal, in other words, born into a perfect state of nature, are taken directly from the writings of Locke, and the ideals that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and it is the right of the people to alter or abolish a tyrannical government, are heavily influenced both by Locke and Rousseau. Two very important traditions have always shaped American government. First is the idea of limited government, which describes a government that is subject to strict legal limits on the exercise and uses of power. Second is the tradition of representative government, also known as republicanism. Notice this is republicanism with a little r, not to be confused with the Republican Party, with a big R. Early Americans' admiration for limited government stemmed from their British heritage. Unlike other European governments of the time, Britain did not have an absolute monarchy. Parliament was an independent body with lawmaking power and local representation. Many of the colonial charters conferred upon Americans the rights of Englishmen, which included, for example, the right to a trial by a jury. The colonies also had experience in self-government. Each colony had an elected representative assembly. The American Revolution was partly a rebellion against Britain's failure to uphold the colony's traditions. During the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, the colonists fought alongside the British soldiers to drive the French out of the Western territories. The British had borrowed heavily to finance the war, which contributed to a budget crisis in Britain. Claiming that the colonists had benefited from eliminating the French, Britain looked to them to help pay the war debt and the cost of keeping a British army in North America. The British Parliament issued the Stamp Act, which taxed the colony's newspapers and legal documents. Although Britain repealed the Stamp Act, it then enacted the Townshend Acts, which taxed imports to America, thereby raising the cost that colonists had to pay for British goods. That was followed by the Tea Act, which gave a British company sole authority to sell tea in the colonies, thereby cutting out American merchants. The colonies were not represented in Parliament, and they bitterly resented the new laws. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry. In 1774, the colonists met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress to formulate their demands on Britain. They asked for their own councils for the imposition of taxes, an end to the British military occupation, and a guarantee of a trial by local juries. British authorities had resorted to shipping troublemakers to London for trial. King George III ignored their requests, and British troops and Massachusetts Minutemen clashed at Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775. 8 colonists died on the Lexington Green in what became known as the shot heard round the world. The American Revolution had begun. A constitution is a basic law that defines how a government will legitimately operate, the method for choosing its leaders, the institutions through which these leaders will work, the procedures they must follow in making policy, and the powers they can lawfully exercise. The U.S. Constitution is exactly such a law. It is the highest law of the land. Its provisions define how power is to be acquired and how it can be used. The first government of the United States was based not on the Constitution but on the Articles of Confederation. Adopted during the Revolutionary War, the Articles reflected the governing systems that the colonists had experienced during the century and a half they were under British rule. Although Britain in theory could override their decisions, each colony had a representative assembly whose members were elected by property-owning males. Towns and cities also had self-governing bodies. From this experience, the colonists acquired a belief in legislative supremacy, the idea that a representative assembly rather than a strong executive is the proper means of governing. They also developed a commitment to local control, believing that a government close to the people was superior to a distant one. Accordingly, the Articles created a very weak national government that was subordinate to the states. Each state retained its full sovereignty, freedom, and independence. This feature of the Articles was also a natural extension of the colonial experience. The colonies had always been governed separately and had different histories and in some cases different religious traditions. Not surprisingly, people thought of themselves first as Virginians, New Yorkers, Pennsylvanians, and so on rather than as Americans. Moreover, they were wary of centralized power. The American Revolution was a rebellion against the arbitrary policies of King George III, and Americans were in no mood to replace him with a powerful national government of their own making. Legislative supremacy was also a defining feature of the government created by the Articles. It had no judiciary and no independent executive. All authority was vested in the Congress, which was beholden to the states. Each of the 13 states had one vote in Congress, and each state appointed its congressional representatives and paid their salaries. Legislation could be enacted only if 9 of the 13 state delegations agreed to it. The rule for constitutional amendments was even more imposing. The Articles of Confederation could be amended only if all states agreed. The Articles prohibited Congress from levying taxes, so it had to ask the states for money. It was slow to arrive if it arrived at all. During one period, Congress requested $12 million from the states but received only $3 million. By 1786, the national government was so desperate for funds that it sold the Navy's ships and cut the army to less than 1,000 soldiers, this at a time when Britain had an army in Canada and Spain had one in Florida. Congress was also prohibited from regulating the states' trade policies, so it was powerless to forge a national economy. Free to do as they wanted, states enacted trade policies designed to protect their manufacturers from competitors in nearby states. Connecticut, for example, placed a higher tariff on goods produced in neighboring Massachusetts than on the same goods manufactured in England. The American states had stayed together out of necessity during the Revolutionary War. They would have lost to the British if each state had tried to fend for itself. Once the war ended, however, the states felt free to go their separate ways. In a melancholy letter to Thomas Jefferson, George Washington wondered whether the United States deserved to be called a nation. A revolt in western Massachusetts put the weakness of the national government on full display. In 1786, a ragtag army of 2,000 farmers armed with pitchforks marched on county courthouses to prevent foreclosures on their land. Many of the farmers were veterans of the Revolutionary War. Their leader, Daniel Shays, had been a captain in the American Army. They had been given assurances during the Revolution that their land, which sat unused because they were away at war, would not be confiscated for unpaid debts and taxes. They were also promised the back pay owed to them for their military service. Congress had run out of money during the Revolution. Instead, they received no back pay, and heavy new taxes were levied on their farms. Many farmers faced not only losing their property but also being sent to prison for unpaid debts. The governor of Massachusetts asked Congress for help in putting down the revolt, but it had no army to send. He finally turned to the state's wealthy merchants who hired a private militia to quell the rebellion. Even before the outbreak of Shays' Rebellion, Virginia and Maryland had invited the other 11 states to meet in Annapolis to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation to strengthen the national government. Only 5 states sent delegates to the Annapolis Convention, which meant no formal action was taken. However, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton convinced the delegates to adopt a resolution calling for a constitutional convention. Congress agreed and called for it to be held in Philadelphia. Congress placed a restriction on the convention. It was to meet for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. But, of course, that's not quite what happened, as delegates immediately began to look at ways that the Articles of Confederation would not only be revised, but replaced with a new written constitution. Something they were expressly prohibited from doing. The delegates to the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention ignored the instructions of Congress, choosing instead to write an entirely new constitution. Prominent delegates including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and James Madison were determined from the outset to create a strong central government. They had come to understand the foolishness of the idea that small government is always the best form of government. The lesson of the Articles of Confederation was that government must have the power necessary to carry out its responsibilities. During the debate over whether or not the Constitution should be adopted, 2 groups quickly formed and began to publish their reasons for and against the Constitution in a series of weekly op-ed pieces in local newspapers. The Federalists, those in support of the Constitution, and Anti-Federalists, those who opposed adopting the Constitution, argued throughout 1787, when the idea of a new Constitution was released to the public after the Constitutional Convention voted to scrap the Articles of Confederation. Published under pseudonyms Publius, for the Federalists, and Brutus, for the Anti-Federalists. Federalists believed in strong central government. Checks and balances would protect from tyranny of centralized authority. Support from urban areas such as merchants and skilled laborers. Small states with weak state governments supported it. The Federalist Papers argued for a strong national government, supported by an elite wealthy class and merchants, and were written by Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, James Madison, and John Jay. As opposed to the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists believed in governing based on protecting people's rights and giving more power to state governments. A strong central government would abuse power. That a privileged minority would be considered greater than the rights of the majority. They doubted that a single central government could control the entire country. They got their popular support from rural areas, as opposed to the primarily big city support for the Constitution. While states with strong economies supported the new Constitution, smaller states, and states that relied primarily on agriculture rather than manufacturing strongly opposed the threat of a more centralized, or unitary, federal government. To spread the word of their opposition to the Constitution, Anti-Federalists like Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Richard Henry Lee wrote the letters from the federal farmer under the pseudonym Brutus, which would become known as the Anti-Federalist Papers. But the Constitution was almost dead before it could even be born. Intense differences between large and small states, as well as between northern and southern states, would lead to one of the most important compromises in world history. Big states, those with large populations and strong economies, supported the Virginia Plan, or the Large State Plan. In this plan, representation would be based on the size of the state's population. This plan would give greater power to larger states and would greatly limit the power of smaller, more rural states. The New Jersey Plan was supported by smaller states. Under this plan, each state would have 1 vote in Congress, giving equal power to both large and small states, but greatly limiting the influence of states that had much larger populations. In order to reach a point of compromise and to rectify the debate over state power, a compromise was reached which would establish a bicameral, or 2-house Congress. Under this new plan, the House of Representatives would become the People's House, with the number of representatives given to each state awarded on the basis of the state's population. Larger states would be given more representatives than smaller states, but each representative would serve an equal number of citizens within their local representative district, and states would see the number of representatives assigned to them updated every 10 years, based on an official national census. In order to balance the power of large numbers given to the House of Representatives, each state would receive the same number of citizens, regardless of population. That number would be 2. Each state, even today, has 2 senators, giving each state the same level of power within the Senate. While originally known as the Connecticut Compromise, this new model of representation was so important to the ultimate success of the new Constitution that it is even known today as the Great Compromise. In further debates and compromises, Congress agreed not to tax exports, only imports. Congress would be prohibited until 1808 from passing laws to end the slave trade. Under what is known as the 3/5 Compromise, 3/5 of the enslaved population of any states counted for apportionment of taxes and political representation, effectively declaring that a slave was worth only 3/5 of a free citizen. Northern delegates were against counting slaves because they didn't have legal rights. Southern delegates were in favor of counting slaves, affording the South more House seats and thus greater political power. This constitutional compromise, while critical in making sure the Constitution would have a chance to see the light of day, would set an important precedent that would ultimately lead to the very thing that the Founding Fathers were trying to avoid, a civil war. Let's quickly review all of the important decisions made by the Founding Fathers during the Constitutional Convention. First, the Founders shaped a Congress that would be based on 2 chambers to check on each other, also known as a bicameral Congress. The House of Representatives would be selected based on population, with each representative elected to short 2-year terms. To balance this, the Senate would be based on equal representation, consisting of 2 senators per state, with longer 6-year terms for stability. The President would be selected in a separate election system, based on the Electoral College rather than a direct popular vote. The executive would not be selected by Congress, but in this new, rather complicated system that would convert the popular vote of the people into presidential electors, and presidents would serve fixed 4-year terms. The judiciary was created as independent from Congress and the executive, and would be charged with making judgments under the law and interpreting the Constitution. Federalism would create a new relationship between states and the national government. It would preserve a significant level of autonomy for states but would be subject to future interpretation over time. Lastly, the big elephant in the room was slavery. Compromises on this issue included the postponement of settlement, making laws prohibiting slavery for at least 20 years, the infamous 3/5 Compromise, counting a slave as 3/5 of a free citizen for the purposes of taxation and representation, a prohibition against taxing exports, known as the Importation Clause, which benefited industrial northern states, and the Fugitive Slave Clause, which stated that slaves were property and must be returned to the state from which they fled. As we can see in this graphic, at the time of the writing of the Constitution, African Americans, most of whom were slaves, were concentrated in the southern states. Southern states, including Maryland, Delaware, North Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, and South Carolina, accounted for a large proportion of the slave population, as compared to the northern states, such as New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Although delegates generally agreed on the powers of the presidency, they differed on its structure and method of selection. Delegates briefly considered the idea of multiple executives, ultimately concluding it should be entrusted to a single individual. It took more than 60 votes to reach an agreement. Finally, the delegates to the convention decided on votes by electors, a process that later became the Electoral College. Electoral votes would give each state the same number of votes as it has members of Congress, thus reaching a compromise between popular selection based on population and state-based selection, giving each state equal say in the selection of the executive. The delegates established their own ratification process. The new Constitution would be submitted directly to the states for approval and would become law if approved by at least 9 of the 13 new states, formerly colonies. On September 17, 1787, delegates to the Constitutional Convention signed the document and began publishing its contents through newspapers, public readings, and face-to-face debates. On September 20, public debates and readings officially began. On September 28, 1787, the Confederation Congress called for ratifying conventions in the states, and the public debate took off with arguments for both sides publicly presented and debated. As mentioned previously, the debate and discourse over the Constitution during the ratification process was undertaken by 2 sides. Anti-Federalists, those who were against a strong national government raised arguments that still echo in American politics. They argue that a strong national government would be too powerful, and state self-governance and personal liberty would be placed at risk. Federalists, supporters of the Constitution, published their defense of the Constitution in a series of newspaper articles that would be known and published as the Federalist Papers. These essays, written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, laid out a persuasive case that would eventually lead to the formal adoption of the Constitution by all of the states, rather than the minimum of 9 originally called for in the Constitution itself. Despite the very public and verbal battles between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, both agreed that there was a need for a stronger centralized government than what already existed under the Articles of Confederation. The difference was in the details. In the end, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, would become the bridge between the two sides. Federalists were in favor of the Constitution as it was written, and felt that the Constitution already assured the rights of citizens, so a separate Bill of Rights was not necessary in their mind. In the eyes of the Federalists, federal laws dealing with trade, treaties, and war should supersede state laws. The federal government should also have the right to levy taxes, which was a power specifically omitted from the Articles of Confederation. Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, feared that the Constitution would put too much power in the hands of the federal government, and they believed that a strong federal government would not take the needs of each individual state into consideration. They thought that an elite social group, concerned with their own interests, would soon control the government, and felt that a formal Bill of Rights that clearly spelled out the rights of individuals was necessary. The Bill of Rights clearly and explicitly protects the rights of citizens, such as freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, a guarantee of a trial by a jury of one's peers, and appropriate access to legal counsel, as well as protections of, and from, religion. The Bill of Rights would guarantee that everyone would have a right to practice their religious beliefs without interference from the federal government, and that no national religion could be established by the federal government. Ultimately, the Bill of Rights would put limits on the power of government that would, over time, prove not only necessary but vital to the success of our constitutional democracy. The framers sought a national government that could act decisively, but not act irresponsibly. They mistrusted unrestricted majority rule. Liberty was the governing ideal they sought most. Individuals should be free to act and think as they choose, provided they do not infringe unreasonably on the freedom and well-being of others. Look at the 2 quotes shown on this page and consider what was motivating the actions and ideas of the Founding Fathers. For instance, James Madison said that the purpose of the Constitution is to restrict the majority's ability to harm a minority. So, in his mind, the overwhelming threat of majoritarianism and what he saw as the tyranny of the majority were explicit threats to individual freedom, so a written constitution was needed to limit the potential negative consequences of an unconstrained majority. Benjamin Franklin said that freedom is not a gift bestowed upon us by other men, but a right that belongs to us by the laws of God and nature. Sound familiar? Remember, Franklin was, himself, an Enlightenment thinker, and was very much influenced by the philosophical ideals of Locke and Montesquieu. The goals of the framers included a government strong enough to meet the country's needs, particularly in defense and commerce. A government that would not threaten the existence of the separate states. A government that was restricted in its lawful uses of power, limited government. And a government that gave the people a voice in their governance, representative government. The primary goals of the framers can be put into 4 thematic categories as shown on this slide. First is strong government, a government strong enough to meet the nation's needs, an objective sought through substantial grants of power to the federal government in areas such as defense and commerce. Second is a federal system of government, a government that would not threaten the existence of the separate states, an objective sought through federalism and through a Congress tied to the states through elections. Third is limited government, a government that would not threaten liberty, an objective sought through an elaborate system of checks and balances. And last, a representative government, a government based on popular consent, an objective sought through provisions for the direct and indirect election of public officials. One of the most important functions of a written constitution is to explicitly list powers that may be exercised by the government, clearly list powers that are denied to the national and state governments, and to lay out a process by which changes could be made, within the limits of law and conforming to the popular will of the people and the states. It's also important to understand that just as limiting authority and powers of government, the Constitution was made difficult to formally amend, so that majority will could be acknowledged, and minority needs and wishes could be considered at the same time. This is why our Constitution has only been formally changed 27 times in nearly 250 years, yet it has been interpreted and executed in a variety of adaptive ways over that same period of time. This is why most political scientists describe the Constitution not as a dead or dying document, but as a living, breathing document that was designed to be flexible and adaptive to the changes seen by this country over time, and as society itself has changed over that time. Montesquieu's concept of a separation of powers was adopted and ingrained into the Constitution so that powers could be divided amongst separate branches rather than investing them entirely in a single individual or institution. Madison's Federalist No. 10 discussed the problem of overbearing majorities, or as he described the problem, as the tyranny of the majority. The framers' special contribution to the doctrine of the separation of powers was that each branch would have the capacity to check the power of the others while still limiting the overall power of the federal government itself. Let's take a look at Table 2-2, which lists the constitutional provisions for limited government. Grants of power were included in order to explicitly grant powers to the national government, and any powers not specifically granted to the national government are, in most cases, denied to the national government. Denials of power are powers that are expressly denied to the national and state governments by the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. Separation of power describes the division of national government's power among three power-sharing branches, with each one acting as a check on the powers of the other two. The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which list individual rights that the national government cannot abridge or deny. Lastly, elections give power to the voters to select and to remove officials from office. Drawing on the ideas proposed by French political philosopher Charles Montesquieu, the national government was separated into three branches: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Each branch of government was given specific and unique powers that could not be exercised by the other branches. This system is known as separation of powers. The idea behind separation of powers is to use the structure of government to control both the institutions of government and the officials within those institutions. In addition to separation of powers, each branch of government was given certain powers over the other branches. For example, Congress can impeach and remove officers of the executive and judicial branches. The executive branch has the law enforcement power and the power to command the military, and the judicial branch has the power to interpret law and the Constitution. This system is known as checks and balances. Under the principle of separation of powers, separate branches interlocked in such a way that an elaborate system of checks and balances is created. For instance, Congress can be checked by the President and the Supreme Court. The President and members of the executive branch can be checked by Congress and the Supreme Court. And the courts and judiciary can be checked by the President and Congress. When these checks are used to extend and restrain powers through interlocking oversight, separation of powers extends to a system of checks and balances. The U.S. Constitution separates power among the legislative, executive, and judicial branches but assigns each branch part of the power of the other two branches so that it can act as a check on their power. Let's extend our understanding of checks and balances into even further detail, as shown in Figure 2-2 of your textbook. The Supreme Court, in its power to check over the President and the executive branch, may declare an executive action unlawful because it is not authorized by legislation, and by way of judicial tradition and common law, may declare a presidential action unconstitutional if it appears to violate provisions of the Constitution. The Supreme Court, in its power to check over Congress, has the power to interpret legal disputes arising under acts of Congress and, by tradition, may declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. Congress, in exercising oversight power over the President, may impeach and remove the President, may override a presidential veto, may investigate presidential action, must approve treaties and executive appointments, and enacts the budget and laws within which presidential action occurs. This latter power is known as the power of the purse, or we might even describe it as Congress's power to defund executive actions it doesn't agree with. Congress can exercise checks over the Supreme Court by first deciding the size of the federal court system, the number of Supreme Court justices, and the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. It may impeach and remove federal judges, may rewrite legislation that courts have interpreted, and may initiate constitutional amendments, as well as confirming judicial nominees, who then serve life terms. or until they decide to retire. The president may exercise checks over Congress by vetoing acts of Congress, recommending legislation, though he or she lacks the power to introduce such legislation for formal consideration by Congress. Only a member of Congress may do that, can call Congress into special session, which is rarely done, and executes and interprets laws that have been enacted by Congress. And, lastly, the president may exercise checks over the Supreme Court by nominating federal judges, pardoning those convicted in federal court, executing court decisions, and thereby affecting how those decisions are implemented by the executive branch. To the framers, the risk of popular government was what James Madison described as tyranny of the majority, the people acting as an irrational mob that tramples on the rights of the minority. From Madison's perspective, popular democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention. And as Thomas Jefferson said, a democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49%. The framers nevertheless believed the people deserved, and required, a voice in their government, so the idea of a representative republic, interlaced with constitutional restrictions, and limited government, became a new form of American democracy. This was a true experiment, combining the majoritarian aspects of a pure democracy with institutional and constitutional controls and constraints, while also allowing individual states a share of the power through a system of federalism, and giving the people themselves authority through a republican system of government, with the people selecting their representatives and leaders within that government. To think about it, this was almost a Frankenstein's monster of different governmental systems and ideals that, despite the long odds against it, has proven to be what Winston Churchill once called the worst form of government except for all the others that have come before it. To the framers, democracy was a form of government in which the majority has absolute power, or, as Jefferson so eloquently described it, a system where 51% of the people are allowed to trample on the rights of the other 49%. This idea scared the Founding Fathers, and rightfully so. Instead, the framers preferred the concept of a republic, a government that has limits on its power, where the people have rights guaranteed by a constitution and that are protected through carefully designed institutions. While the people do have a level of popular sovereignty through a system of elections, majority rule in a republic is limited in order to protect minority rights. The House of Representatives was initially the only institution based on direct popular election. This is why, even today, it is described as the People's House. But to make government responsive to popular majorities, senators were to be appointed by the legislatures of their states. Each state would have the same number of electoral votes as members in Congress, and their electors, the Electoral College, would select the president. Federal judges and justices would be appointed to life terms, in order to give them a level of judicial autonomy and to avoid potential interference from either the president or Congress. Now let's look at how our federal officials are selected and the length of time they may serve within any one term. The president is selected by an electoral college, with the number of electors awarded to each state based on the number of representatives that state has in Congress. In other words, the number of House members awarded to that state is based on its population plus the number of senators for that state, which is always 2. The president may serve 2 4-year terms, unless the president has taken over for a president who either died or resigned from office. In that case, the term may be up to 10 years, 2 elected 4-year terms plus up to 2 years serving out the term of the previous president who died or resigned. United States senators were originally selected by their respective state legislatures, but that changed to a system of direct popular vote with the 17th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1913. Senators may serve an unlimited number of 6-year terms, and 1/3 of senators are up for re-election every 2 years, so they serve staggered terms in order not to make the entire Senate run for re-election all at once. This guarantees what is known as a continuous lawmaking body. Unlike senators, it is said the United States representatives are always running for office, since they serve 2-year terms with the entire body going up for re-election in even-numbered years. While representatives may serve an unlimited number of terms, and well over 95% of all incumbent representatives win re-election every 2 years, this is still a much more transitory body of government, which was designed to be the most responsive to the popular will of the people they represent. Lastly, federal judges are nominated by the president and approved by the Senate. They serve indefinite terms of service, basically for life, or until they retire subject to what the Constitution terms as good behavior. Rarely is a federal judge or Supreme Court justice ever removed from office, or impeached and convicted. This is an intentional design of the system, in order to ensure judicial autonomy and to eliminate the possible bias that political pressures may place on them. Two types of democracy have arisen since the signing of the Constitution. And because of the actions of the presidents to which these forms of democracy are associated, we call them Jeffersonian democracy, where government belongs to all, not just the elite, and Jacksonian democracy, which urged states to award electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote, yet is also known for favoring that same elite by way of pork barrel policies and unconstrained federal hiring based on favoritism rather than merit. The progressives champion primary elections, which would give ordinary voters the power to select their party nominees, rather than to leave it to party leaders to select a candidate in a backroom slap-on-the-back deal rather than based on what rank-and-file party members really wanted. Under progressive reforms, senators would be directly elected beginning in 1913 with the 17th Amendment, and a further set of reforms were introduced in many states that would allow for initiatives and referendums. Initiatives would allow the people themselves to introduce new laws by way of popular vote, and referendums would allow those same voters to directly remove someone from office based on popular election. The Constitution assigns the election of the president to electors chosen by the states, with each state having electors equal in number to its U.S. senators and representatives. Voters have an indirect voice in the selection. Each state, except for Maine and Nebraska, awards all of its electoral votes to the candidate who wins the state's popular vote, the so-called unit rule. This arrangement usually results in the election of the candidate who wins the national popular vote, but not always. In the 2016 election, Donald Trump lost the popular vote but became president by winning enough states to give him a slight advantage in the Electoral College. Since many southern states like Texas and Florida, along with smaller Midwestern states, gave Trump more electoral votes than did coastal states, Trump was able to win that slight majority of electoral votes. But this was not a normal election year. However, 2020 was more like a normal election year, where both the popular vote and the electoral vote went to Joseph Biden. The type of government created in 1787 might best be called a constitutional democratic federal republic. Constitutional in that power gained through elections is to be exercised in accordance with law and with due respect for individual rights. Democratic in that it provides for majority influence via elections. Federal in that states govern themselves independently of each other, yet power is shared between each state and the national, or federal government. Republic in that it has a mix of deliberative institutions, each of which moderates the power of the others, and the people have a say in their government's policies, decisions, and laws through the selection of elected representatives and leaders. Today's model of American government is more a representative government than a pure democracy. This is because we have more frequent elections than any other democracy. We're the only major democracy in the world to rely heavily on primary elections rather than general elections. We're also less democratic than some other major democracies because of the constitutional barriers and constraints that have been built into our system. These include divided branches, staggered terms of office, and separate and distinct constituencies.